In the blistering summer of 1851, when the Memphis slave markets roared like a living beast, buyers and traders swore they had seen every kind of man walk across those wooden platforms: broken men, defiant men, proud men, and desperate men. But on one suffocating afternoon, the crowd fell silent as a single chained figure was led into the yard. A young male slave whose appearance was so striking, so unnaturally beautiful, that witnesses later claimed the air itself felt different around him. His skin seemed to glow even in the dust. His eyes carried a depth that didn't belong to someone in bondage, and women in the crowd whispered that he looked almost unreal, as though he had stepped out of some ancient painting rather than a plantation field. Within minutes, the bidding turned violent. Men shoved each other aside. Wealthy plantation owners arrived running. Even the auctioneer, a man who had sold thousands of enslaved people, stumbled over his words like he had forgotten how to speak. No one could explain why, no one could understand what made this particular young man inspire obsession, envy, fear, and desire all at once. But the strangest part wasn't his beauty. It was what happened to the men who bought him, because every master who ever owned this young slave, every single one, met a fate so bizarre, so sudden, and so impossible to explain that rumors began spreading across Memphis like wildfire. Some said the young man was cursed. Others said he wasn't entirely human, and a few whispered that he carried a secret so dangerous that anyone who tried to control him sealed their own doom. The story begins the moment he stepped onto that Memphis platform, when the crowd saw a face they would never forget. But none of them realized they were also witnessing the start of one of the most chilling mysteries the South had ever seen. The heat over the Memphis auction yard rose in shimmering waves, bending the air into something almost dreamlike as buyers gathered shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising and falling in the familiar rhythm of trade. The clatter of boots on wooden planks, the crack of a whip in the distance, the shouts of traders calling out numbers. These were the sounds that usually filled the yard from sunrise to dusk, so constant that no one ever really heard them anymore. But on that particular afternoon in 1851, something happened. Something subtle, small, almost invisible, that caused the entire crowd to shift. Then, still as though the world had paused for a reason none of them could name, it began when a handler at the far corner shouted for space, his voice cracking slightly, not with authority but with something close to unease. Buyers turned instinctively, some annoyed at the interruption, others curious about what could make that seasoned handler speak with such strength. They expected to see another trembling field hand or a chain gang dragged out of the wagon, but what stepped into the light made the entire yard fall into an unnatural silence, the kind that prickled across the skin and settled in the bone. People who were mid-sentence closed their mouths without realizing it. Men who had been laughing let the sound die unfinished in their throat. Even the horses tethered along the fence stopped pawing the dirt, their ears tilting forward sharply as if the presence of the young man being led to the platform had rippled through them as well. He walked with the slow, reluctant steps of someone who knew eyes were on him but refused to glance up and meet them. Chains hung from his wrists, but they did not seem to drag him down the way they did with others. Instead, the metal caught the sun in a strange way, flickering against the contours of his arms as though the light itself was trying to cling to him. Some in the crowd later swore the boy's skin seemed almost to glow, catching the dust and refracting it like fine gold powder, though no one could explain how that was possible in the dim, gritty light of the auction pen. Others said his posture carried something they had never seen, neither defiance nor surrender, neither pride nor fear, but a quiet, unreadable presence that made people draw in closer, not because they wanted to but because they felt compelled to. Women at the edges of the yard covered their mouths without realizing they were doing it. A pair of old traders who had spent lifetimes in the business leaned forward like men who had stumbled upon a secret they were not sure they wanted to know. And the auctioneer himself, a man with a belly like a keg and a voice like gravel, blinked twice as though he had been struck by a sudden dizziness. He lifted his hand to signal the start of the sale, but when he opened his mouth to shout the first number, no sound came out. The crowd saw his lips move but heard nothing, as if the young man's arrival had swallowed the noise from the air. People shifted, eyes narrowing, trying to understand what they were seeing. Beauty was not unheard of. There were always slaves whose looks sparked interest or drove up price, but this was different, unsettlingly different. His features were too symmetrical, too still, as if painted by a hand more skilled than nature. His eyes, downcast yet alert, seemed to hold a depth that made even the wealthiest buyers hesitate to look at them direct, not because they were strange but because something in them suggested an awareness, a kind of silent comprehension of the crowd, the chains, the moment, the entire world unfolding before him. It was this impossible presence that caused the whispers to be quiet, scattered at first, then picking up like a breeze, gathering strength. No one wanted to speak too loudly, but everyone needed to say something. Anything to break the strange pressure rising in their chest. Some whispered that he must be the child of a master too well featured to be ordinary. Others murmured that he didn't look enslaved at all, that his posture was too composed, his expression too knowing. A handful of older buyers exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing a disturbance they couldn't name. They had spent decades in this trade and had never once seen an entire yard robbed of its sound so quickly. They had never seen a crowd of hardened men freeze in place, staring as though under a spell. As the handler brought the young man closer, even he seemed unsure of his steps. His hand trembled slightly where it gripped the chain, and the heel of his boot skidded once on the dusty board. This was a man who had wrangled the strongest, most rebellious slaves without hesitation. Yet something about the presence beside him made him falter. When they reached the platform, the handler stepped back faster than he intended, almost tripping over the edge. It was then that the crowd noticed another small, unsettling detail. The young man did not seem winded from the long walk across the yard, despite the heavy sun and the weight of the chain. His breathing was calm, almost too calm, as though he had been waiting for this moment or had already foreseen it. The silence deepened. A thick, almost tangible tension settled over the plain. The auctioneer cleared his throat again, trying to force strength back into his voice, but the sound came out thin and unsteady. He adjusted his hat, wiped his face, and finally managed to speak, though the first number trembled as it left his lips. It didn't matter. No one heard, because the moment the auctioneer spoke, every pair of eyes in that yard remained fixed on the young man, unable to tear away long enough to acknowledge anything else. Men who prided themselves on never showing weakness felt something inside them a sense of curiosity blending with unease. Fascination knotted with something closer to fear. It was not simply the young man's beauty that held them. It was the feeling, indescribable, impossible, that his arrival had changed something in the air, that the world before them was no longer quite the same as it had been a moment earlier, that they were witnessing the beginning of something they did not understand and could not control. And though none of them realized it yet, the silence that fell over the Memphis auction yard that day would become the first sign, the first warning, the first whispered clue to a mystery that would haunt every man who dared to claim possession of him. The silence that had swallowed the Memphis yard did not last long. It broke not with a whisper but with a violent snap, an eruption of voices, chairs scraping, boots pounding across the planks as men surged forward like a wave released from a dam. The auctioneer barely had time to lift his hand before the crowd erupted into chaos, each man convinced that if he didn't act immediately, someone else would seize the treasure standing on the platform. The first bid was shouted so loudly it cracked in the air, followed immediately by another, then another, piling over each other in a frenzy that made the auctioneer flinch. He had never seen men bid so fast, so recklessly, without even hearing the opening price. It was as if the entire yard had gone mad at once, as though the presence of that young man had triggered something primal that no one could control. Men shoved and grabbed at each other with a desperation that didn't match the scene. This wasn't cotton. This wasn't land. This wasn't gold. This was a human being, yet something about him drove them into a frenzied hunger to possess him, to own him, to claim something no one else could. One plantation owner threw his hat to the ground, face red with fury, shouting out a number so high his bookkeeper gasped behind him. Another man, usually calm and calculating, went pale as he shouted a bid double that amount, his voice cracking raw against the hot air. The auctioneer tried to regain control, pounding his gavel again and again, but no one was listening. The bidding had become a chaotic battle, a contest of wills, pride, and something deeper, something unspoken that made the men feel that owning this young man meant gaining more than labor, more than status, more than mere possession. Even the spectators on the edges felt. Women who had come only to watch, not to bid, gripped their shawls and stared wide-eyed as the men around them lost their composure. A pair of young boys who had been chasing each other between the crates stopped cold, drawn in by the rising pitch of desperation. Slaves waiting and holding pens turned their heads, sensing the disturbance as if a shift had passed through the ground beneath them. A few muttered short prayers under their breath, unable to explain why their hearts beat faster as they gazed toward the platform. They knew fear, they knew cruelty, they knew suffering in its many shapes. But this fever burning through the crowd, felt like the start of something none of them had seen before. The young man at the center of it all remained completely still. No fear flickered across his face, no confusion, no anticipation. His eyes stayed down, his jaw relaxed, his breathing steady, as though the chaos swirling around him had nothing to do with him at all. It was this calm, this impossible calm, that drove some bidders even wilder. They sensed something in him they could not place, something they did not understand, and the lack of understanding only made them want him more. A man's mind always fears what it cannot name, but it desires it too, in a twisted way, especially when status, Ego and reputation are at stake. One bidder, a wealthy merchant from Nashville known for his ruthlessness, elbowed his way to the front, his voice booming with authority as he shouted a figure that made the crowd recoil. Eyes turned to him, some astonished, others furious. A man beside him spat into the dust and countered with a number even higher, driven not by logic, but by something that felt like challenge, like defiance, like the belief that he, not anyone else, deserved the prize before them. Another planter shoved between them, his breath sour with whiskey, insisting that this slave was destined to belong on his estate, as though fate itself had reached down and whispered it in his ear. Something unhinged gleamed in his eyes, the kind of look men got only when reason had already slipped out of reach. The auctioneer tried to regain control, wiping sweat from his brow, his voice trembling as he attempted to organize the numbers being hurled at him from every direction. He shouted for calm, for order, for patience, but the more he pleaded, the more his voice cracked, and the more the yards spiraled away from him. It wasn't a bidding war anymore, it was a riot waiting to ignite. Two men nearly came to blows when one accused the other of trying to intimidate him with shoulder pushing. Another man drew his gun halfway from the holster before his companion grabbed his arm and hissed at him to regain his senses. But senses were exactly what these men lacked. They were gripped by something stronger than reason, something that made them forget their wealth, their dignity, their fear of scandal or judgment. They were consumed by the need to possess the young man whose stillness contrasted sharply with the chaos he had unleashed. The young man finally lifted his head, slowly, deliberately. His eyes swept across the men shouting, fighting, sweating in the dust. The moment those eyes rose, a hush rolled through the closest cluster of bidders. They could not explain why. There was nothing overtly threatening in his expression, no hostility, no pleading, no arrogance, and yet something in his gaze froze them, as though he saw through each man past the bluster and the wealth, and the bravado straight to whatever truth they tried to keep hidden. It lasted only seconds, but it was enough to chill the air around the platform, enough to make several bidders stumble over their next shouted numbers, suddenly breathless without knowing why. But the frenzy returned, stronger, sharper, like a storm regaining its strength after a brief fault. The bids climbed higher than any sale in the yard's recent memory. The auctioneer swore inwardly as he realized the numbers were climbing into territory he had never expected, never imagined. This sale alone could change his entire month's ledger. The handlers exchanged nervous glances. They whispered among themselves that this was wrong, that no slave, no matter how skilled, how strong or how fair, should provoke such mania. One handler muttered that the price of owning the boy felt like a curse, though he couldn't explain what he meant. At the far edge of the crowd, an elderly man who had been watching silently took a small step backward, gripping the fence for support. He had been in the trade for 40 years, long enough to see horrors and miracles alike, but never had he seen men fight like this over a single human being. He whispered to the man at his side, but his voice wavered. "Something's wrong with this one," he said, eyes fixed on the platform. "Not with him. No, with the way men look at him, with the way he makes them forget themselves. I've seen beasts that could shake a yard. I've seen men collapse under curses, but beauty has never made men lose their minds like this." The bids climbed higher still, sweat dripped, voices strained, the crowd tightened, drawing closer and closer as though some invisible force pulled them toward the platform. Every man wanted him, every man feared losing him, every man felt deep in the silent place inside himself that obtaining this young man meant gaining power or losing something he could never recover. And though none of them realized it yet, the violence of that bidding war would be remembered not as a sign of value but as a warning, the first violent tremor in a long chain of inexplicable events that would leave the South whispering for decades to come. Rumors began the same way dust rises, quietly at first, unnoticed by most, drifting between boots and wagon wheels, until suddenly it fills the air so completely that no one can breathe without tasting it. That was how the talk of the young man's impossible beauty spread through Memphis, not through official ledgers or auctioneer announcements, but through the whispers of men who wouldn't normally waste a breath on describing another man's looks. It happened within minutes of his appearance on the platform. A trader standing near the front, a man known for his cruelty and bluntness, muttered something under his breath, something about the boy looking unnatural. A woman overheard and clutched her shawl tighter. A stable hand carrying a bucket stopped mid-stride after stealing a glass. Even a traveling preacher, who had come only to observe the sins of commerce, froze with a strange expression on his face, as though the sight had rattled him in a place he thought long closed. The word beautiful was not one people used lightly, especially not in the context of the slave market. Men were described as strong, fit, skilled, able-bodied. Women were described,
often crudely by features meant to justify their price. But beauty, true, breathtaking beauty, was something rarely spoken aloud because it challenged the order of things. It suggested value beyond labor, beyond ownership, beyond chains. And this young man's beauty was not the kind that inspired admiration. It was the kind that unsettled, that forced people to question what they were seeing, that made them glance twice as though the first look had deceived them. The whispers traveled quickly. By the time the bidding reached its fever pitch, the crowd was divided between those who tried to deny what they felt, and those who could no longer pretend they were unaffected. Some claimed he held himself too gracefully for someone who had endured hardship. Others insisted his eyes looked too clear, too calm, carrying none of the dullness or rage typically seen in the enslaved. A group of women watching from a shaded corner whispered among themselves that he resembled the kind of figure artists tried and failed to capture in portrait. One of them, an older widow who had seen her share of misery, muttered that no human being was meant to look like that. Not in chains, not under the sun, not in that place. The unsettling part wasn't just his appearance, it was the effect he had on others. Men who prided themselves on their judgment felt suddenly uncertain. Men who were normally decisive hesitated, caught between desire and fear. A young buyer from Mississippi, who had just inherited his father's plantation, found his hand trembling as he raised it for a bid. He didn't understand why. He tried to push away the feeling, but something about the boy's presence seemed to reach inside him and stir emotions he couldn't identify. He wasn't alone. All across the yard, buyers shifted uncomfortably, their bodies responding to something their minds couldn't articulate. Stories began forming instantly, each more strange than the last. Some breathed that the boy's beauty was a trap, that it was the kind meant to lure men toward misfortune. Others insisted he must have hidden lineage, too refined to be ordinary, too poised to have grown up in hardship. A few went further, suggesting he wasn't entirely mortal, that perhaps his appearance was a sign of something supernatural. No one dared to say such things loudly, but the murmurs grew beneath the clamor of the bidding, attaching themselves to every gasp, every sideways glance, every uncertain step backward. Even those who scoffed at superstition felt something crawl along their spine. An overseer who had seen countless auctions leaned toward his companion and whispered that the boy made him uncomfortable, not because of anything he did, but because of the way the crowd behaved around him. Men were losing their sense. They were shouting over one another, tripping over words, acting as though they were bewitched. Never seen beauty make men stupid like this, the overseer muttered, shaking his head. His companion gave a stiff nod, but his eyes remained locked on the boy, his breath short and shallow. What struck people most was the stillness the young man carried with him. It wasn't a stillness of fear or resignation, it was something else entirely, something self-contained, as if he knew more about the people staring at him than they knew about themselves. There was no arrogance in it, no challenge, but there was a quiet certainty that made people uneasy. It was as though he recognized every whisper, every gasp, every attempt to explain him away. He didn't flinch when men raised their voices. He didn't tense when they fought to outbid one another. His expression didn't change when someone cursed, or threatened, or pushed forward with fists clenched. He simply stood there, composed in a way that suggested he had seen far worse, or perhaps far more than they could imagine. The effect of his beauty wasn't limited to the crowd. Even the handlers felt it. One of them, a man hardened by years of this work, confessed later that he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling in his gut when he laid eyes on the boy. He said, he felt as though the world had shifted slightly, tilting in a direction he didn't recognize. Another handler found himself staring too long, forgetting for a moment that he was supposed to be guiding the sale. It wasn't admiration that held his gaze, it was confusion mixed with a faint, inexplicable dread. As the whispers grew, they twisted into stories more elaborate than the truth. A few spectators said his skin looked luminescent, glowing even beneath the dust. Others swore his eyes held different colors depending on the angle of the sun. One woman claimed his reflection in a nearby water trough seemed delayed, as though it lingered a second too long before moving. These were exaggerations, warped by fear and fascination, but they spread quickly, carried by people eager to make sense of what they couldn't explain. Some insisted he had been raised in secret by wealthy whites before being stolen or sold behind closed. Others theorized he belonged to an unknown tribe with features never seen in the South, and a handful whispered darker tales, stories of curses, omens, spirits that took human form. They said, any man who looked too perfect was not a blessing but a warning, a sign that something unnatural lay beneath the surface. What people didn't realize was that their whispers were less about him, and more about themselves. They were projecting their unease, their guilt, their desires onto a young man who remained silent under the weight of their imagination. They didn't know his history, they didn't know his name, they didn't know what he had endured, or what he carried inside, but they felt something, and that feeling was powerful enough to spark fear in even the toughest of men. By the time the bidding reached its peak, the whispers had become a storm of speculation, weaving through the yard like a current of electric air. The young man's beauty had become more than a physical trait, it had become an omen, a symbol, a warning, and though no one could explain why, every person in that yard knew the same truth, deep down, that whatever made him so striking, so unsettling, so impossible to ignore, was not ordinary. It was something else entirely, something capable of shaping destinies, of altering fates, of pulling men toward futures they didn't see coming. And those whispers, those uneasy murmurs about his impossible beauty, would be the first sign that the men who sought to own him were stepping into a story far more dangerous than they realized, guided by a force they didn't understand, and would later fear to even speak of aloud.
The plantation of Thomas Keene stood a few miles outside Memphis, a sprawling estate surrounded by fields that shimmered beneath the Tennessee sun. Keene was a man known for two things: his pride and his paranoia. He trusted no one, not even his own kin, and certainly not the enslaved people who bent under the weight of his authority. When he won the bidding war for the mysterious young man, it wasn't because he needed another laborer. It was because he wanted possession of something no one else could have. He wanted to prove he was the kind of man who could own beauty, control it, command it, bend it beneath his rule. But the moment the boy arrived at Keene's estate, strange unease rippled through everyone who saw him, from the overseers to the field hands to the household staff who caught fleeting glimpses of him as he was led toward the living quarters. Keene didn't want him working in the field. He decided instead to keep him close, assigning him to light household duties under his personal supervision. Yet every time Keene glanced at the boy, something tightened in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name and didn't want to. It wasn't admiration, though the young man's presence was undeniably arresting. It wasn't fear, though something about the boy unsettled him in ways he fought to ignore. No, it was something else, something that made Keene restless, pacing his study at night, unable to explain the knot forming in his gut, whenever he thought of the calm, silent figure moving through his home. The first night passed uneventfully, though some in the household claimed the air felt heavy, as if a storm had crept into the walls. The second night, a servant girl swore she heard someone whispering in the hallway outside her room, words she couldn't understand spoken in a voice too soft to belong to Keene or any of the overseers. She cracked open her door, but the hall was empty except for a faint trace of warmth in the air, as though someone had just been standing there moments earlier. By the third night, the whispers spread. Overseers reported sleeplessness. Field hands spoke of strange dreams that made them wake in cold sweats. Even Keene's prized hunting dogs refused to go near the young man, growling low in their throats whenever he passed by. Keene dismissed it all as superstition. He had paid more than any reasonable man would, and he would not allow rumors or fear to undermine his authority. He ordered his men to get a hold of themselves. He threatened punishments for anyone caught spreading nonsense. But the unease continued, settling deeper, becoming something heavier than rumor, something that pressed on the air like an unseen weight. Then came the accident in the stables. One of the overseers found himself locked in the lower stall in the middle of the night, even though he swore he'd left the latch open. He claimed he heard footsteps outside, slow, steady, deliberate, yet when he called out for help, the steps faded and he was left alone in darkness until someone found him at dawn. "Did you see who it was?" the others asked. His face went pale. "He didn't turn around," the overseer whispered, though no one had asked about turning, but I knew it was him. Keene became irritable. He shouted more often. He paced his office like a man being watched, though no one dared approach him. He began drinking more heavily at night, muttering to himself, glancing at doorways as though expecting someone to materialize in them. He had once been proud, confident, sure of his supremacy, but now each day that passed seemed to chip away at him. He caught himself avoiding the boy's eyes, though he didn't understand why. Something in them gnawed at him, something too steady, too aware, too calm. 5 days after the purchase, Keene hosted a supper for 2 neighboring plantation owners, hoping to distract himself with conversation that reminded him of his power, his wealth, his status. But as the evening unfolded, he found it difficult to focus. Shadows along the wall shifted subtly when he wasn't looking. A draft swept through the dining room despite the windows being closed. At one point he dropped his fork when it felt as though someone was standing directly behind him. When he whipped his head around, the space was empty. His guests exchanged glances. They noticed the tremor in his hands. They noticed the sweat on his brow. One even asked, half-jokingly, if he was haunted. Keene forced a laugh, but it cracked halfway through, hinting at the frayed edges of his nose. Later that night, Keene insisted on checking the slave quarters himself, something he had never done before. The overseers followed at a distance, uneasy. When they reached the boys' quarters, the young man was sitting on the edge of his cot, calm as ever, his hands folded loosely in his lap. There was no expression on his face, no sign of emotion, no acknowledgement of Keene's trembling presence. The lamp in Keene's hand flickered violently, casting long, crooked shadows across the walls. The overseers shifted nervously, whispering among themselves. Keene asked the young man a question, something meaningless, something he didn't even remember, just to hear the boy speak. But the young man lifted his eyes, silent, and looked directly at him. That was the moment Keene felt something cold stab through his chest, something like fear but deeper, sharper, more primal. He backed away abruptly, almost tripping over his own boots, mumbling to the overseers that everything was fine, that he didn't need anything else. But his voice shook. His face had gone pale. By midnight he was pacing again, his footsteps echoing through the house. He poured drink after drink, his hands barely able to lift the glass. He muttered that the boy was too quiet, too calm, too no. He watches, Keene whispered into the empty room, even when he looks away. By morning Keene was dead. The household found him in his study, his face frozen in an expression of terror so deep, so carved into his features, that even the hard-hearted overseers stepped back in shock. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, no trace of poison. The doctor who examined him insisted his heart had simply stopped, but he couldn't explain the twisted, rigid terror in Keene's dead eyes. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Whispers claimed Keene had been cursed by the boy. Others said he had seen something in the darkness before he died. A few claimed the beauty of the young slave was a mask hiding something dangerous, something not meant to be owned. No one dared speak these theories aloud near the boy himself. When he was led out of the study and back toward the quarters, he showed no reaction to the death, no confusion, no fear, no sorrow. His expression remained unchanged, as calm as the day he first stepped onto the auction platform, as though he had known all along how Keene's fate would unfold. And with Keene's sudden, inexplicable death, the pattern began, a pattern that would follow every man who dared believe that possessing the young man meant owning the force that lived behind his silent, unreadable eyes. From the moment the plantation owners began whispering about the disappearance of objects, small at first, then increasingly valuable, the overseers believed it was the work of a clever thief hiding somewhere among the enslaved. The missing items didn't follow any logical pattern. A silver spoon vanished one day, a brass key the next, followed by a pair of boots, and then an entire ledger book that had been locked inside the office. Nothing about these vanishing objects made sense, and yet each time someone tried to investigate, the trail ended in the same place, a narrow corridor leading to the old storage barn at the back of the property. That barn, older than most of the plantation itself, was known among the enslaved for something else entirely. Its shadows didn't behave like shadows, at least not according to those who had dared to step inside at night. Every disappearance was followed by a quiet dread among the workers, because they knew the pattern even if the overseers didn't. The thief wasn't a person, at least not in the way the plantation owners imagined. The enslaved whispered a different story, one that stretched back decades, about something that moved silently through the plantation grounds, slipping through cracks, drifting between wooden beams, and waiting in the places the sunlight never touched. It was said to be older than the oldest worker, older than the plantation's founding, older even than the land deeds that hung in the main house. And according to those who had inherited the stories, this thing, whatever it truly was, only took objects that had been touched by fear, anger, or blood. That meant the missing items weren't random at all. They were a record of something deeper, something the owners refused to acknowledge. But when the overseers tried to confront the enslaved for answers, they found only silence. That silence wasn't defiance. It was terror. Those who knew what the shadow in the barn represented never spoke of it openly, because speaking of it was believed to be a kind of invitation, a way of drawing its attention. The elders said it listened through the cracks between breaths, that it could slip beneath doors and through the spaces between floorboards, and that if it heard its own story spoken aloud, it would follow the voice that uttered it. And so the enslaved kept their heads down, their eyes averted, and their lips sealed whenever the subject came near. The barn became a place no one entered willingly, even though the overseers occasionally forced someone inside to search for the missing item. They always returned empty-handed, pale-faced and trembling, insisting that the objects simply weren't there. What made the mystery more unsettling was that no one ever heard movement in the barn. No footsteps, no shuffling, no dragging sounds, yet the dust on the floor was always disturbed whenever an item disappeared. Long sweeping arcs, as though something without shape had crawled or slithered through. Sometimes the marks looked like fingerprints, but stretched unnaturally long,
as if someone with hands twice the length of a human's had brushed against the ground. Other times they resembled the impression left by a large cloth being pulled across the floor, but nothing inside the barn could have created such trails. The enslaved workers knew that the barn had once been used as a storage place for the bodies of those who died under brutal conditions before proper burial could be arranged, and some believed that the shadow belonged to one of those forgotten souls, left behind and twisted by rage and sorrow, until it became something entirely different. The plantation owners never found a rational explanation, though some tried. One owner insisted there must be a thief among the enslaved who was clever enough to hide the objects, somewhere no one had looked yet. He sent men to search the fields, the quarters, the sheds, even the riverbanks, but nothing ever turned up. Another owner hired a traveling detective from the city, a man known for solving complex cases with uncanny accuracy. He lasted only one night before leaving at dawn without his payment, refusing to speak a word about what he had seen inside the barn. He packed his horse in silence, his hands shaking, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold morning air. When asked why he was leaving so abruptly, he whispered that nothing on earth could make him stay another night on that property. The enslaved children, who often understood things long before adults expected them to, warned each other never to bring anything valuable near the barn. They knew that once an object carried fear, even for a moment, it could vanish without a trace, if brought too close. Some children claimed they had seen movement inside the dark windows when passing by, shapes shifting behind the glass like smoke swirling against the surface. Others said they heard whispers coming from the cracks in the wood, whispers that sounded like someone speaking from far underground. And every time an object disappeared, those whispers grew louder, as though the thing inside the barn grew stronger with each item it consumed. Even the animals sensed something was wrong. Horses refused to go near the back path leading to the barn. Dogs barked at the empty doorway at night, their fur standing on end. Livestock that wandered too close were found trembling or refusing to eat for days afterward, as though they had glimpsed something their minds could not comprehend. The plantation workers took these reactions seriously, believing animals could see things humans could not. They created makeshift rituals to protect themselves, tying small bundles of herbs near their beds, drawing symbols in the dirt outside their quarters, avoiding the barn entirely once the sun began to set. But no matter what they tried, the disappearances continued, each one more unsettling than the last. Eventually one of the enslaved elders, a woman known for her deep knowledge of the old stories, warned that the objects wouldn't be the only things taken forever. She said the shadow was growing restless, that it had fed on fear for too long, and that soon it would want something larger, something alive. No one knew whether she meant this as a metaphor or a literal danger, but the fear in her voice suggested she believed it completely. The overseers brushed off her warnings, but the enslaved felt the ground shifting beneath their feet, as though a line was being crossed, as though the disappearances were simply the beginning of something far more dangerous. The night everything changed on the plantation began like any other, humid, slow, heavy, with the kind of silence that made every sound feel amplified. But beneath that silence was something else entirely, something the enslaved workers recognized long before the overseers were aware. It was the same unsettling sensation that crept through the air each time the shadow in the barn stirred. That night, the workers moved with unusual caution, avoiding the back path, refusing to go near the old barn even when ordered. They knew the signs. The animals knew them too. Horses stamped nervously, their eyes reflecting the torchlight in wide, frightened circles. Dogs whined at the corners of the buildings, refusing to approach the barn even when dragged. The elders whispered that the shadow had been active all day, that they felt it like a pressure behind the eyes and a weight on their chest. Inside the main house, the plantation owner and his guests laughed over wine, unaware of what lingered beyond the glow of their lantern. They spoke loudly, their voices carrying through the night air, but every few minutes their words seemed to fall oddly flat, as if something was swallowing the sound just beyond the porch steps. Several of the workers noticed it first, the way the breeze stopped entirely, leaving the trees completely still. Not a single leaf moved, even the insects silenced themselves, which had never happened before. The elders exchanged worried glances because they knew the story well. When the air went still and the sound faded, the shadow was no longer confined to the barn. The workers pretended to keep performing their chores, but their eyes flicked constantly toward the dark silhouette of the barn. It looked different that night. The outline seemed slightly warped, as though the structure were breathing. The wood looked darker than usual, like it absorbed the moonlight instead of reflecting it. Once, just once, a faint glow pulsed inside. Not the warm color of lanterns, but a cold, dim light, like something luminous struggling deep beneath water. No one wanted to imagine what that meant. The older workers knew the tale of the first time the barn glowed. That was the night a worker vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a scattered pile of tools and a single handprint on the dirt floor. stretched unnaturally long. As the night deepened, the overseer decided the missing objects had become too much of a humiliation. The plantation owner demanded answers and he wanted them before sunrise. Rumors of the barn stealing items were spreading through nearby plantations, and the owner refused to let his land become a subject of mockery. The overseer, already angry from being unable to solve the mystery, marched toward the enslaved quarters, and ordered several men to accompany him to the barn. They begged him not to force them, but he didn't listen. Fear only made him angrier. He gave them no choice. They followed reluctantly, their hands trembling, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow, fully aware that nothing good would come from disturbing the place at night. When they reached the barn door, the overseer paused. Even he could feel something was wrong. The air was too cold, colder than the night should have allowed. A light mist hung around the structure, though the sky was dry and cloudless. The wood of the door felt damp when he touched it, almost pulsing, as if it had a heartbeat. One of the workers whispered that they should leave, that the barn wasn't a place for the living that night. The overseer raised his whip to silence him, but before he could strike, a low sound vibrated through the ground. It wasn't a growl, not quite, nor was it the sound of a shifting building. It was deeper, resonant, like something speaking through the earth itself. The workers froze, their breath catching in their throats. The overseer stepped back, realizing for the first time that he might have underestimated the stories he had brushed off for years. Still, pride made him push forward. He unlatched the door and pulled it open. The darkness inside was unnatural. Lantern light refused to enter it. Instead of illuminating the interior, the light seemed to bend away, as though repelled. The workers behind him whispered prayers under their breaths, clutching charms and tokens given to them by elders. The overseer stepped inside, holding his lantern high, but the flame flickered violently. The moment he crossed the threshold, the ground trembled again, this time stronger, rattling the lantern's metal frame. The flame went out. Everything went silent. The enslaved workers didn't dare move. Their eyes strained to see into the darkness, but it was impenetrable. They could hear the overseer breathing, shallow and fast. Then something else joined the sound, a soft dragging noise like fabric being pulled across wood, then a whisper, faint and broken, as though coming from many directions at once. The overseer choked out something, maybe an order, maybe a plea, but before anyone could react, there was a sharp sickening thud, followed by a gasp. The workers heard him stumble, heard him claw at the wood, heard something pull him deeper into the barn. They did not scream, they could not. Fear held them completely still. Several seconds passed, maybe minutes, before the lantern rolled out of the doorway. It was dented, bent in a way that suggested something large had crushed part of it. The workers stared at it, their hearts pounding so loudly they could barely hear anything else. And then the darkness in the doorway shifted, not like a human figure moving, but like smoke thickening, rising, taking shape for the first time, just enough to give the impression of height, of awareness. The workers fled. They didn't look back. They ran through the fields, past the quarters, toward the main house shouting for help, but the words tangled in their throats. Some collapsed from fear before they even reached the port. The plantation owner stumbled outside, irritated and half-drunk, demanding an explanation. But when he looked across the yard and saw the barn, its windows glowing faintly, the mist curling around its roofline, his anger drained into confusion, then into the glow pulsed again, brighter this time, like the beat of something massive, waking from sleep. And somewhere inside the house, every missing object began to rattle at once, as though answering a silent call, as though preparing to move again, as though the shadow had grown strong enough to claim something far more valuable now.
For weeks the traders in Memphis whispered about the boy's past, trying to piece together fragments of rumor and half-truth. But the deeper they dug, the more impossible the story became. At first the boy's silence made the traders assume he had simply been bought and sold too many times, or that he was one of the many whose histories were erased by owners who didn't bother to record more than a name and a price. But there was something unnervingly intentional about the gaps in his story. It wasn't the normal kind of absence, a misplaced document here, a burned record there. This was different. This was precise, deliberate, as if someone had gone through extraordinary lengths to ensure that no one could trace where he had come from or who he had belonged to before he arrived in Memphis. When the first trader tried to investigate, he found only one document attached to the boy, a worn receipt noting the transfer from a small rural holding in Mississippi. But the signature was incomplete, as if the person writing it had been interrupted in the middle of their name. The ink was oddly smudged too, not by water or handling, but in a way that blurred everything except the boy's age and the date. Anyone with experience knew that slave traders didn't make mistakes with receipts. Too much money depended on clean paperwork. A smudged name was not an accident. The trader sent a writer to find the holding listed on the receipt, But when the rider returned, he said the place wasn't just abandoned. It looked like it had been deserted in a single night. Clothes left hanging, tools dropped in the dirt, food rotting on tables. Not a soul left behind, no graves, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just absence. Like an entire community had evaporated rather than moved. The trader asked the boy if he knew what happened to the place, but the boy only looked at him with a calm, unredeemable stare, offering neither fear nor confusion nor memory. His eyes carried something older than experience, something that made the trader uncomfortable and unwilling to press further. But that was only the beginning of the strangeness. Another trader claimed he recognized the boy, swore he had seen him on a different plantation months earlier, but when he searched his logbook for the name of that plantation, the page where it should have been was missing. Not torn out, missing. The book went straight from page 1 untorn. The thread between the pages was intact, untouched, as if page 113 had never existed in the first place. When he asked the boy if he had ever lived in Louisiana, the boy tilted his head slightly, as if the question itself was confusing, as if Louisiana were a place that didn't completely register in his memory. The trader assumed he was lying, but something in the boy's expression bothered him long after he walked away. Eventually, one of the more meticulous traders, a man known for keeping better records than most banks, decided to verify the boy's origins himself. He wrote to the courthouse in Mississippi requesting birth records, sales logs, and any documentation on the holding listed in the receipt. Weeks later, the letter came back unopened, stamped with a short note claiming the building had burned down months earlier in a fire that destroyed every document inside. The trader found this suspicious, so he asked a contact in another county to visit the courthouse. That contact came back frightened, claiming the building wasn't burned at all. It was standing perfectly intact. People were inside, going about their work, but when the contact asked about the boy or the holding, the clerks froze. They didn't deny knowing him. They didn't confirm it either. They simply refused to speak, watching him with a silent, collective unease that he described as unnatural. Meanwhile, the boy moved through each place he was kept with a strange grace that contradicted everything the records refused to show. He worked without complaint. He learned tasks faster than expected. He rarely spoke, but when he did, the tone of his voice had a softness that didn't quite match his circumstances. It unsettled the overseers. They expected obedience, fear, resentment, anything familiar. What they got instead was something they couldn't categorize, something that made them hesitate every time they tried to raise their voice at him. The boy seemed like someone who didn't fully belong to the world they lived in. He was too calm in chaos, too composed in cruelty, too aware in silence. Some said he must have come from a wealthy household that educated him, but his hands were calloused like someone who had labored since childhood. Others said he must have been the child of a foreigner, but his accent matched no region, no country, nothing recognizable. A preacher, upon seeing him, claimed the boy looked like someone who had seen something he shouldn't have, but refused to elaborate. Every time someone thought they had found a clue to his origins, the clue dissolved, contradicted itself, or led to a dead end. The boy's age changed depending on who asked. His birthplace never aligned perfectly between stories. Even the scars on his back, scars that should have revealed the style or habit of a particular overseer, didn't match any whipping pattern known in the South. The marks were too clean, too linear, too uniform, as if carved by a blade rather than inflicted by punishment. But no plantation used blades for discipline. No overseer admitted to anything like it, and the boy never explained. One night, an elderly woman among the enslaved workers approached him, carrying a small charm wrapped in cloth. She said she recognized him not personally but from stories whispered long before she was born. She said people like him were never supposed to be sold, never supposed to belong to anyone, and that their histories were erased on purpose, not because of carelessness, but to protect those who tried to keep records. The boy listened quietly, neither accepting nor rejecting her word. But when she tried to give him the charm, he stepped back, shaking his head softly, as if he knew the charm wouldn't help, as if he knew it could not protect him from whatever had erased his past in the first place. From that moment, the workers avoided asking questions about where he came from. They sensed something heavy behind his silence, something tangled in secrets older than any plantation. And yet, the traders continued their search, driven by greed or curiosity or the simple human desire to understand something that defied logic. But each new attempt only made the mystery greater. Every document lost, every witness gone missing, every place connected to him abandoned or destroyed. It was as if the world itself resisted revealing who he truly was, as if his past had been swallowed by something vast and unspoken long before he ever stepped onto the platform in Memphis. The disasters did not begin with a loud crash or a violent storm. They started subtly, almost quiet, like the world around the boy was shifting in ways too delicate for most people to notice. On the first plantation he was sent to, The owner congratulated himself on having acquired such a rare specimen of beauty and strength, convinced he had made a purchase that would elevate his status. But within days, the livestock began acting strangely. The horses refused to enter the stables, snorting and pulling away even when whipped. Chickens stopped laying eggs. Cows bellowed at the empty corners of the field as if seeing something no one else could. Most dismissed it as coincidence, but the elder workers exchanged looks of caution, recognizing a pattern they had seen only a handful of times in their long, painful years. Animals sensed things humans ignore, and they sensed something around the boy that made them restless. Then came the first real disaster. The plantation's well, which had survived decades of storms without issue, suddenly collapsed inward. None of the workers were near it. No heavy equipment sat over it simply caved in, swallowing the bucket system and turning the water muddy and unusable. The owner blamed the workers, though no one understood how such a deep structure could fail so cleanly. They rebuilt the well, but within a week the second well cracked down the middle as if struck by lightning, though the sky had been clear all day. By then the whispers had begun, not among the white owners or overseers. They were too proud to admit fear, but among the enslaved workers who slept light and listened closely to every shift in the night air. They said the boy did not bring the disasters, but the disasters followed him, the way storms follow pressure or the way shadows lengthen at dusk. On another plantation far from the first, the pattern grew bolder. The owner noticed that one of his barns seemed unusually cold at night, not from drafts or missing boards, cold in a way that made breath visible and made wood creak softly, as though shrinking from some unseen presence. The workers said the cold always came after the boy was sent inside, even if he was only there to stack hay or carry tools. One night, the owner set a lantern near the entrance to watch for thieves. The flame burned normally at first, then shrank into a faint glow the moment the boy entered, dimming as though starved of air. When the boy stepped out, the flame brightened. The owner, refusing to accept this, repeated the test 3 more times. The lantern responded the same way each time. He told no one, but he became less eager to keep the boy in enclosed spaces. After that came the incident with the tobacco field. The harvest had been promising that year, and the owner expected strong profits, but within days of moving the boy to field work, entire patches of tobacco withered overnight, not from disease, not from insects. The leaves simply dried, curled, and fell like ash. Workers reported hearing a faint humming sound around the dying plants, something soft and rhythmic, like distant singing carried through the wind, though no one could understand the words. Some insisted the boy was never near the fields when the plants withered. Others claimed they saw him walking through the rows just before dawn, pausing between the tallest stalks, standing still for long stretches as though listening for something. But whenever questioned, the boy said he went nowhere except where he was ordered. His voice always calm, always quiet, always steady. One plantation tried to isolate him completely. The owner believed that the disasters came from contact with the other workers, that perhaps the boy spread misfortune like a sickness. So he was given his own small cabin at the edge of the fields far from the quarters. The owner thought this would contain the strange occurrences. Instead, the cabin became the center of strange lights flickered in the windows at night, not candlelight, but a pale bluish glow that pulsed softly, as though alive. Workers saw shadows moving inside even when the boy was outside working. Sometimes the shadows were tall, sometimes small. Once, a worker swore he saw a figure with impossibly long arms reach from the corner of the window frame, only to vanish the moment he blinked. The owner accused the workers of trying to frighten him, but even he could not explain why the cabin door was always cold to the touch, even on the hottest days of summer. By the time the boy reached his next plantation, stories traveled ahead of him. The previous owners whispered warnings to the traders, but never said them with complete honesty, afraid to sound superstitious and foolish. They spoke in half-truths, hinting at bad luck, unfortunate timing, or poor infrastructure, pretending the disasters were normal misfortune. But the workers who passed stories through whispers, glances, and shared dread, knew better. They knew that wherever the boy walked, something followed, something unseen, something patient. On the next plantation, the owner's young son became fascinated with the boy. He followed him everywhere, asking questions, imitating his movements, lingering near his workspace like a shadow. The boy tolerated it quietly, neither encouraging nor dismissing the child. But then the child began having dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams in which he described a figure standing outside his window tapping softly on the glass. He said the figure had no face. He said the tapping matched his heartbeat. The owner dismissed it as childish imagination until the boy mentioned, calmly and without emotion, that the same figure used to stand outside the windows of his first cabin before he was ever sold. The owner pulled his son away from the boy after that, forbidding him from going near him. But it was too late. The child fell ill days later,
a strange fever that no doctor could identify. He mumbled in his sleep, describing the faceless figure again, saying it stood inside the room now, not outside. The fever vanished as suddenly as it came, but the boy's presence became unwelcome after that. The owner sold him quietly, without announcement, wanting nothing more to do with him, or whatever strange force was attached to him. Each plantation told a different story, but the pattern remained the same. Failed wells, sick animals, sudden frost in the heat of summer, tools disappear, lanterns dimming, workers feeling watched, owners growing restless, children dreaming of figures that did not belong to the living. By the time the boy arrived at his last plantation, even the traders grew nervous handling him. They spoke to him less. They avoided meeting his eye. They refused to keep him overnight, insisting he be transported quickly, without delay, without lingering in any place longer than necessary. They did not say it out loud, but they all felt the same thing in their bones. Something did not just follow the boy, it was bound to him, woven into him, drawn to him in a way no one could understand, and every place he lived paid a price for that presence. By the time the boy arrived in Memphis for the final sale, his reputation had preceded him in ways no ledger, no advertisement, and no trader could have predicted. Everyone who saw him at the market felt the shift immediately. Buyers whispered nervously among themselves, more concerned with his history than his price, as if the stories of misfortune clung to him like shadows in the sunlight. Some had seen what had happened to previous plantations, some had heard the stories from traders who dared not sell the boy lightly, and some, who had been present at previous auctions, refused to bid at all, claiming their instincts told them it was unwise to attempt to own him. The murmurs did not frighten the boy. He stood on the auction platform, calm, silent, and impossibly still, as though he could feel the anxiety ripple through the crowd, but remained untouched by it. The bidding began quietly, and at first it appeared ordinary. Men called out numbers, overlaid with polite competitiveness, each raising their stakes slightly higher. But as the boy's gaze swept over the crowd, something happened. Bidders hesitated mid-call, as if their words caught in their throats. Hands shook while lifting paddles. One man even dropped his coin purse entirely, swearing it had moved on its own. It was not overt, not dramatic in a way the traders could accuse of trickery, but subtle, insidious, and undeniable. The boy did not speak, did not flinch, did not signal in any way, yet every person present began feeling the same unexplainable unease, a creeping certainty that some unseen force had entered the auction hall. The first bid that broke the tension was absurdly high, beyond what most of the men considered reasonable for a single enslaved person, no matter his beauty or apparent strength. The crowd gasped, exchanging shocked glances, yet the bidder who called it out did not seem fully aware of the amount he had stated. He merely felt compelled to speak. By the time the next bid rose, the nervous hesitation had taken root in everyone else. Men who had arrived confident and proud now stumbled over their words, their judgment clouded by a combination of fear, fascination, and something deeper they could not articulate. The boy's beauty had become less a matter of admiration and more a matter of influence, bending the will of those around him without ever touching them. People whispered that the boy's eyes were different. One angle revealed a gray so pale it seemed almost silver. Another angle gave them a depth that appeared black, infinite, unreadable. Buyers claimed that when he looked directly at them, the air thickened, pressing against their chests, as though invisible hands had wrapped themselves around their rib cages. Those who tried to glance away found their eyes returning involuntarily, drawn by an irresistible pull they could neither explain nor resist. Even men who had faced death, storms, disease, and the cruelty of other men found themselves unnerved by the simple act of his gaze. Traders, accustomed to calculating value and ignoring sentiment, could not reconcile the arithmetic of his price with the impossibility of his presence. When the final bids approached, the whispers had turned into small incredulous conversations. Some muttered in fear, some in awe. There were those who swore the boy had been in more than one place at once, seen walking simultaneously across separate plantations, though such claims were dismissed publicly as exaggeration or rumor. But every person present had seen the evidence of his impossible past: burned and abandoned properties, wells collapsing without cause, crops withering, animals panicking. The boy's history had become legend, each story adding weight to the invisible presence that accompanied. It was not merely a man being sold, it was the culmination of mysteries, disasters, and inexplicable events that no ledger could record and no ledger keeper could fully understand. A young trader eager to make his fortune decided to take the risk. He called out a sum that would have been considered extravagant under any circumstances. The moment he spoke, the boy's gaze shifted slightly toward him, not dramatically, not in an obvious gesture, but enough that everyone else in the auction hall felt a chill pass through. The trader's confident smile faltered, his voice caught. He realized with sudden clarity that the boy was aware, not aware in the usual human sense, but aware in a way that seemed to penetrate beyond ordinary comprehension. It was as if the boy could see every fear, every desire, every unspoken thought, and hold it suspended before him for examination. The second bidder, an older man who prided himself on rationality, decided to compete. He called out a higher price. The room shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Chairs scraped, coins rattled in purses. Men leaned forward involuntarily. Some muttered prayers under their breath. The boy's expression did not change, yet a tangible force, imperceptible yet undeniable, seemed to pulse outward from him, drawing attention, influencing thought, and bending circumstance. It was clear that the boy's beauty was inseparable from the strange power that followed him, a combination that had made each previous plantation crumble in small, inexplicable ways. By the time the final call came, the tension was nearly unbearable. The auctioneer, who had seen countless sales, spoke quickly, trying to maintain authority, but even he faltered as the boy's presence pressed against the edges of perception, making the air feel thick and heavy. Everyone in the hall knew the same unspoken truth. The boy was not merely a human to be bought or sold. He was something larger, something that defied the usual measures of commerce, authority and understanding. The highest bidder finally called out, sealing the transaction, and the crowd erupted into a mix of awe, relief and fear. Yet beneath it all, an unshakable sense of unease remained. Something about owning the boy had changed them all, whether they realized it or not. The boy's new owner stepped forward to claim him, but even this act was accompanied by uncertainty. The moment the boy's hand was touched, the air seemed to shiver. A door slammed somewhere in the building. A lantern flickered violently. The livestock outside began a chorus of restless noises, as if the world itself were aware of the change in possession. The traders who had profited from his sale felt a strange disquiet they could not shake. Some refused to acknowledge it, dismissing it as coincidence. Others left the hall muttering under their breath, the memory of the boy's presence pressing against their consciousness. Even the enslaved observers, who had watched the boy quietly from the edges, recognized the pattern repeat. The boy's influence was not limited to wealth or beauty. It was far more insidious, far more powerful. Where he went, people thought differently, acted differently, sometimes even failed to act at all. Where he went, luck and misfortune seemed bound together in ways that could not be predicted. The transactions of the day were completed, but the invisible consequences had only just begun. Those who had claimed to control him discovered too late that control was impossible. The boy moved not just through spaces, but through perception itself, leaving in his wake questions no ledger could answer, mysteries no trader could solve, and fears that would linger long after the sound of the auctioneer's hammer had faded.
After the auction, the boy's new owner believed he had achieved something extraordinary. He had acquired what the traders called the most beautiful male slave ever seen in Memphis, and he imagined the boy would increase his status, impress visitors and become a centerpiece of his household. But from the first moments of ownership he realized that what he had purchased was not just a person. There was an aura, a presence, a subtle weight to the boy that no ledger, price or word could fully explain. When he walked through the house, shadows seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if following him, stretching longer in unnatural ways. Even the servants, who had witnessed countless slaves come and go, felt the pull of something impossible, something that existed just beyond the realm of comprehension. The first evening in the new household was quiet. The boy was given a small room near the back of the property, simple but neat. He did not complain about the accommodations, nor did he seem particularly pleased. He moved through the tasks assigned to him with a calm efficiency that unnerved the overseers. They were used to being able to predict reactions, to gauge obedience, to understand fear or excitement. But with this boy they found themselves unsure. His silence was not stubbornness. It was not ignorance. It was a deliberate stillness, as though he carried within him a space that no one else could enter. That night, the household's dogs refused to sleep inside. They growled low in their throats, pacing along the walls, snapping at shadows no one else saw. The horses shied violently when led near the stables, refusing to enter without coaxing. The cats hid under furniture, ears flattened, eyes wide. The servants whispered among themselves that this was unusual even for a new arrival, and some dared to suggest that the boy brought with him a power, a force that unsettled animals, people and even the very structure of the house. But the owner, eager to assert control and unconvinced by superstition, dismissed these concerns as exaggeration. By the second day it became apparent that misfortune followed him silently. A lantern tipped over on the staircase, setting a small fire that was extinguished only by swift action, yet the soot remained, blackening the walls and floor. Tools left in the yard vanished overnight, only to be found in unusual positions the next morning, suspended halfway up a tree lying in the middle of the riverbank or tucked inside the storage shed that was supposed to be law. Objects moved without explanation, and every time someone claimed to have seen the boy nearby though never interacting with them. It was as though his mere presence caused subtle alterations in the environment, slight but undeniable. Neighbors began to note, on walks or during visits, they felt a strange heaviness in the air when the boy was present. Lanterns flickered in his proximity. Conversations faltered. Even those who tried to convince themselves it was coincidence admitted privately that there was something unsettling about his presence. The owner, embarrassed by the growing murmurs and determined to assert authority, attempted to control every aspect of the boy's life. He ordered him to perform specific tasks, to present himself in certain ways, to follow strict schedule. The boy complied perfectly without complaint, but the disasters continued, subtle and persistent. Wells overflowed, crops wilted in certain patches, and livestock displayed increasingly unusual behavior, particularly near the boys' quarters. Then came the incident with the guest from the neighboring plantation. The man had come to discuss a trade, confident and assertive, certain of his position. The boy greeted him quietly at the doorway. The moment their eyes met, the man stumbled mid-sentence, faltered over words he had said countless times before, and eventually left abruptly, claiming to be The owner was furious, blaming nerves or alcohol, but the servants and field hands whispered that they had never seen such a reaction before. The boy's gaze had a quality that unsettled even experienced adults, bending their perception without physically touching. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The days grew longer, the tension more pronounced. Even the owner, who had believed he had complete control over his property and those on it, began to feel uneasy. He caught himself checking rooms repeatedly, locking doors unnecessarily, and glancing over his shoulder. Objects in the house moved without explanation, whispers floated through hallways at night, and shadows seemed to take shapes that did not belong. Despite his attempts to rationalize, he could not dismiss the pattern. No previous slave had ever elicited this combination of fear, awe and disruption simply by existing within the house. The boy meanwhile remained calm and composed, never speaking unnecessarily, never reacting visibly to the chaos that seemed to follow him. It was as though he was aware of it all, yet unaffected, impervious to what humans perceived as danger, discomfort or fear. Servants claimed that when they approached him with questions or concerns, he met their gaze with a steady, unreadable expression, giving them a sense that he understood far more than he revealed. It was a knowledge beyond the normal comprehension of those around him, and it grew more pronounced with each passing day. One night, during a storm, the power of his presence became impossible to ignore. Lightning struck nearby, trees snapped, and the wind howled through the property with unusual force. The house shook, lanterns went out and the animals panicked, yet the boy remained sitting quietly by the window, watching, almost as if he had anticipated the event. No one dared approach him, and yet the chaos seemed drawn toward the edges of the house, as though avoiding him, or perhaps orbiting him like some unseen gravity. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the sense of unease lingered, heavy and palpable, in a way that made everyone, including the owner, realize that the boy's presence was not to be measured by conventional means. Stories began to spread among the other enslaved, whispered late at night, of the boy's impossible influence. Some claimed he could move things without touching them. Others swore that he could see things before they happened, anticipating events that left people shaken. Yet no one could confirm, and no one dared to question him directly. Even the owner, despite his pride and stubbornness, began to leave tasks undone rather than confront what he could not understand. The boy existed within the household as both a presence and a puzzle, altering the environment, influencing perception, and leaving those around him unsure of the boundary between human and something far more enigmatic. The boy's beauty, so frequently admired in the market, became almost irrelevant compared to the weight of his presence. People forgot the symmetry of his features, or the elegance of his posture. They remembered the cold, impossible stillness, the unshakable calm, the sense that he existed slightly out of reach of ordinary reality. Guests who came to the house found themselves unusually quiet in his presence. Servants moved cautiously, and even the owner began to doubt his ability to command the household fully. The boy did not act against anyone. He simply existed, and that existence reshaped the dynamics of the home in ways no ledger, no auction, and no contract could control. By the third week in the new household, The boy had settled into his daily tasks with the same precision and calm that had unnerved previous owners. Yet the pattern of misfortune, subtle disasters, and unexplainable phenomena persisted. Objects disappeared, animals reacted unpredictably, doors that had been locked were found open, whispered sounds and faint movements in the hallways disturbed even the most seasoned servant. And the boy as always remained composed, silent, and aware of every change, as though he had anticipated these events long before they occurred. No ledger keeper, no auctioneer, and no plantation owner could ever fully contain the truth of who the boy was or what followed him. The records of his life were scattered, smudged or deliberately erased. The stories passed through whispers and hushed warnings, growing more unbelievable with each retelling. Yet everyone who encountered him, traders, enslaved workers, overseers and neighbors alike, carried the same undeniable memory, a presence that bent reality, a gaze that pierced beyond comprehension, a calm that unsettled even the most hardened heart. Some swore he was human, others whispered he was something older, something woven from shadows, disasters, and impossible beauty. Wherever he went, the world itself seemed to respond, as if acknowledging a force no one dared name. By the end, it was clear to anyone who dared to reflect, this boy could not be owned, tamed or understood. He was a story the world had not yet caught up to, a living paradox that challenged the very notion of possession and power. And long after the auction hall fell silent, long after the plantations faded from memory, long after the records burned or were lost, one truth remained: some mysteries do not wait to be solved. They endure, quietly, unnervingly, impossible to forget, impossible to control, and impossible to ignore.